Hello and welcome to this latest edition of our podcast here at Manor Park Classics. My name is Ed and you'll probably recognise me from my incessant rambles about cars over on our YouTube channel where I've been privileged to take out some of the wonderful lots we get in here. But today I'm on my lonesome and we're going to do a bit of a historical deep dive. So you'll probably have seen a few weeks ago I was privileged to drive a Jaguar XJS. It was the first time I'd ever piloted an XJS, and it was a lot that we had in here, and otherwise, I love XJSs, and so naturally I was very interested in it. But after that promo video that Jaguar put out, after their rebrand, and after, of course, them showing off the Type 00 concept, everybody's suddenly talking about Jaguar. So I wanted to do a little video about that XJS to talk a little bit about its history, about its context, and about how while we may think the Type 00 is deeply controversial, Jaguar have form for doing that kind of thing. So today, I don't want to talk about the Type 00. Instead, I want to take the Type 00 and relate it to Jaguar's history and figure out what it tells us about Jaguar's history. So we're going to go through essentially all of Jaguar's post-war history, talk about some of the cars they made and how they evolved over time and how we came to our perceptions we have today about Jaguar, about how maybe they've been stuck in their ways for a little bit too long and how they've tried to take the challenge to the German premium marques, and it hasn't been all that successful, which is why now they're having to have a total rethink and they're really kind of starting from scratch. So as I said a moment ago, we're going to start from immediately after the Second World War, when SS cars renamed themselves to Jaguar cars, and we get the launch in 1948, 49, there or thereabouts, of the XK120. We're going to take two separate lines, really. We're going to look at Jaguar sports cars and Jaguar saloon cars and figure out how they kind of funnel down to today and how people's perceptions to them in period, I feel, are really quite forgotten nowadays, because these cars were fresh, they were contemporary, they were very, very modern, they were controversial in some ways, they were always different to everything that came before. But now we see them as part of this really rich tapestry of Jaguar, this tapestry of where they've been throughout the last however many years. So I've got some notes written down, and as I said, the XK120 launched in 1948 with that fantastic 3.4-litre XK straight six. A six-cylinder engine that Jaguar would use all the way through to the 1980s. Of course, it has an aluminium cylinder head. I believe it had a cast iron block, though I might be misremembering now. But regardless, twin-cam cylinder head, 3.4 litres in its first form in the XK120. And of course, as the name suggests, it would do 120 miles per hour. That was with no windscreen, which is a bit of a trick that Jaguar had. Jaguar liked to modify their cars to make them a little bit quicker than they actually were for when the press reviewed them, so they would get favourable press. That makes a lot of sense. But yeah, 120 miles per hour was the headline, was the big figure, which made it the fastest production car in the world. Jaguar had come out immediately after the Second World War in austerity-riddled Britain, a country that was not doing fantastically well, was not recovering that quickly from the Second World War, because while Britain had been, and Coventry, where Jaguar, of course, based, was relentlessly bombed, British infrastructure was in a much better condition, for example, than German infrastructure. And so for the next however many decades, Jaguar were able to really carry on. They had a few incidents. They had a fire, for example, at Browns Lane. But Jaguar were able to carry on, and Jaguar retained, should I say, a lot of their rather antiquated machinery, their antiquated production facilities for many, many years, which we will get to in a while, because that did start to scupper them. But it meant that Jaguar could come out of the Second World War and immediately produce the fastest car in the world, produce this very fresh, very lithesome, curvy sports car, of course, which was the XK120. And in 1948, the XK120 was aggressively modern. So compared to an MG or a Morgan, which are two other, famous British sports car marques, they were still producing very traditional-looking cars with running boards, etc. The Morgan appearance that we still have today, it's the one that we know, because Morgan didn't really have the money to replace their line of traditional sports cars, and so they just kept building them. When critics of Morgan, of which I'm not, by the way, but when critics of Morgan say that it's a car they forgot to stop building, they kind of have a point. Morgan just did not have the facilities to produce an all-new sports car, and that's why they retained that, very classic silhouette. But Jaguar had moved on from that silhouette very, very early in the game. In 1949, Morgan produced a new 4.4 or +4, I can't quite remember. My brain is everywhere. It's nearly Christmas. But they developed a new car, but it still looked like an old sports car. MG, for example, was still building the T-type cars, the TD, the TF, etc., of which we have an example of here. I didn't aim for this to be a plug, but it's kind of becoming one because still unsold, it's a lot still available from our December auction, is a little MG, I think it's a TD rather than a TF. Yes, it's a 1953 MG TD, British Racing Green. It presents really, really nicely, that thing. But from that car, you get what I'm talking about. Very traditional cars with their exposed wings, running boards down the side. Jaguar had abandoned that. The Jaguar XK120 was not only the fastest car in the world, but it was also a very, very modern car as well. And of course, it replaced the SS100, which was the first car to be called a Jaguar. It was a model name, which after the war, because of the connotations with SS cars, they naturally renamed themselves and they chose Jaguar. So it's a totally new ball game for Jaguar. And while I've mentioned Morgan and MG, which of course sit a little bit below Jaguar in the kind of hierarchy of sports cars, I want to just prove to you where they sat relative to some others. So we're going to talk about Aston Martin. So today, Aston Martin, of course, are the builder of brilliant GTs and borderline supercars, which do 200 miles per hour. They're worth a fortune. They cost a fortune. That's where Aston Martin sit. That's their market position today. And it's certainly not Jaguar's market position today. But I want to bring you back to the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s, when the XK120 was on sale, and the equivalent, or not equivalent Aston Martin, but the line of Aston Martins that we know best, of course the DB line, they had their 2-litre Sports, the car that retrospectively became known as the DB1. That car only had 4 cylinders. And of course it was only 2 litres in capacity. The Jag's 3.4 litre straight 6. That's just the kind of, that's the market at the time. And that Aston Martin DB1 only had 90 brake horsepower. It would only do 93 miles per hour. And compare that, of course, to 180 brake horsepower of the Jaguar and a 120 mile an hour top speed, if you take liberties a little bit, of course. Then we can move over to Italy and look at Ferrari, their 166, the 195, the Ferrari 212, the Inters, the Ferrari Inters. And they were very conservatively styled. Yes, they had a V12, but it was only a very small capacity V12. It was only in 1952, when the Ferrari 250 was introduced, that they could take the fight to the XK120. And yes, Ferrari was only in its its founding years at the end of the 1940s into the 1950s. Jaguar had been around for a little while longer. But considering the context of late 1940s Britain, considering the late 1940s motor industry and how everyone was trying to get back on their feet, the XK120 was a total statement of intent. We've really laboured that point here about the XK120, but I want to be very clear about it because Jaguar were on top of the world, building the fastest car in the world, one of the prettiest cars in the world. The XK120 was everything. And of course, it was replaced by the XK140 and, of course, the XK150. But then we get to the end of the 1950s, or actually, we'll move back a little bit into the mid-1950s, and Jaguar are entering Le Mans. They have the C-Type and later the D-Type. And the former of those, the C-Type, of course, morphed into the D-Type, and then, of course, we have the E-Type, and that sounds like a natural progression, but, from the start, there wasn't a preceding B-Type or an A-Type. Instead, the C-Type was actually an XK120C. The C standing for competition. It's only really retrospectively that we know it as a C-Type when we relate it to its successors. So the XK120 is everything. It wins Le Mans in competition form with that more aerodynamic body, etc. But the XK line of sports cars are replaced in 1961, of course, by the E-Type. Now, the E-Type is a car we all feel duty-bound to love, and in relation to the Type 00, it's the car that everyone seems to hark back to. It's the car that everybody wants to remember and say, that's what a Jaguar should look like. As Brits, we are somewhat duty-bound to remember the E-Type, to love the E-Type, and you know, I totally adore the E-Type. It's become fashionable in recent years, I feel, for people to say that they don't really like the styling of the E-Type, but as far as I'm concerned, that's just attention-seeking. I adore the E-Type. The E-Type is everything. We don't need to go into depth about it, but it retains that XK straight six. Now up to 3.8 litres, later to 4.2 litres, of course, and it has Jaguar's brand new independent rear suspension. That independent rear suspension, which was the most sophisticated form of rear suspension on a motor car, probably through to the early 1980s. That Jaguar independent rear suspension was something to behold, and it's testimony to its success, to its geometry, to its overall control, that Jaguar will continue to use essentially that same independent rear suspension through to the mid-1990s. And then they would revise it into a more modern version of that independent rear suspension through to, relatively recent times. So 1961 could be marked as Jaguar's high watermark. When the E-Type launches, everybody loves it. There's that famous Enzo Ferrari quote about it being the most beautiful car in the world, but we don't actually know whether that's true or not. It might be a mistranslation, but regardless, it's a nice sentiment. It's a sentiment I think most of us can agree with, so hey, let's just take it as true. All of these things are fairy tales at the end of the day. So we all have this perception of the E-Type, and it's totally understandable why we have it. But you could also say, if you look at the context surrounding it, you look at the cars that were around at that time and the Jaguars that came before, and you could say it was a little bit controversial. Because it still has that very lithesome, very low, long silhouette of the XK series of sports cars, but it looks totally different. It gets rid of that grille, it gets rid of the accentuated wings, and so it was not an evolution of the XK. Instead, it looked like a totally new car, and barring its engine, it was a totally new car mechanically as well. Jaguar had moved on. Jaguar had abandoned the past, abandoned what did them so well from 1948 to 1961, and had introduced something brand new. And I love that, and that's the start of where we realise that Jaguar were not always following themselves. They did not always regurgitate the same things over and over again. They did not slowly evolve, but quite often they revolutionised their own style. The E-Type was still clearly a Jaguar. It had that very feline presence, but it was totally brand new. And then there's the fact that it was called an E-Type. So I mentioned earlier how the C-Type and the D-Type were Le Mans racers. They were racing cars. That's what they were designed to do. And they won Le Mans in the mid-1950s, but then Jaguar pulled out of Le Mans. A couple of years following the Le Mans disaster in 1955, Jaguar pulled out of motorsport. And so while the E-Type was raced by privateers, it was not fully supported by the factory. And so by replacing the XK150 with an E-Type, but an E-Type that was not a racer like the D-Type was, you could easily say that it was a controversial car. And that's a point that I think we would all be very surprised at when we first hear it and think, put that in the context, and you could understand why some people would say, this E-Type lark, it's not what it should be. It's not what the D-Type was, and therefore I'm not happy about it. You can see how that's now folding into Jaguar's greater history and how we move forwards. So we will park the sports car line there for just a moment, and we'll move over to the Jaguar Saloon cars. So we have the traditional line of big Jaguars, culminating I would say, in the traditional series with the Jaguar Mark 9, which was replaced in 1961 by the Jaguar Mark 10, the last big Jaguar, which I believe remained the widest car sold in Britain until the BMW 7 Series of about 15 years ago. And I think today it might remain the widest car ever produced in Britain. But don't quote me on that, correct me in the comments, get in touch and tell us where I'm going horrendously wrong with that. But the Mark 10 was a tank of a car. Again, big XK straight six, and it had the independent rear suspension that had also been seen in the E-Type. So, you know, if you wanted to describe it like this, it also had triple carburetors, I should say, as well. So if you wanted to describe it, you could say that it was a big saloon E-Type. It had all of that great pedigree. Now, of course, it wasn't the fastest saloon car in the world because it was so honking massive, the Mark 10, and that's why it didn't have the success that Jaguar maybe wanted of it. And it's the failure, the relative failure of the Mark 10 that led directly to Jaguar selling themselves to BMC, the British Motor Corporation, which of course merged with Leyland in 1968 to become the infamous British Leyland. And we're going to a whole different chapter of Jaguar's history there. So the Mark 10 was not a successful car. But it was a very good car from a mechanical perspective. It was just a little bit too large for European taste, and it didn't have the equipment for a car of that size for American taste. And so it didn't meet anyone's requirements, and so Jaguar had to have a rethink. But in 1961, it had that wonderful XK straight six, independent rear suspension, and again, very lithesome styling. The rear half of that car looked quite a lot like the old Mark 9. It just merely evolved into the Mark 10, but the front end was totally new. It looked so much more modern than the old Mark 9. It really brought Jaguar's big saloon line into the 1960s, into this much more modern era. And so, compared to the E-Type, which we've just referred to as a total revolution in Jaguar styling, in Jaguar's approach to the sports car market, you could fairly say that the Mark 10 was more of an evolutionary step. But of course, the Mark 10 was not particularly successful. And that leads us to 1968, when Jaguar replaced both the large saloon line of the Mark 10, for example, and their smaller saloon line of the Mark II and the S-Type with one model. They replaced it with the Jaguar XJ. We'll come to the XJ in a minute, but we'll park that there, and we'll talk about the smaller saloon line. Introduced in 1955, of course, and known by its engine capacity, whether that be 2.4 litres, 3.4 litres, 3.8 litres, or later 4.2 litres. But we know them retrospectively as the Jaguar Mark I and Jaguar Mark II, the Mark II of which was launched, of course, in 1959. And with, again, their XK straight sixes, these cars were the fastest saloon cars in the world when they were launched, when they were brand new. They were very quickly overtaken, but again, that's a big Jaguar statement of intent. It's a compact saloon car. You know, it's not competing on a luxury status with some of the best in the world, because it is that size smaller, but having that smaller size, that lower curb weight, but still having that absolute powerhouse of an XK straight six, it can be the fastest car in the world, fastest saloon car in the world, should I say. But as Jaguar's saloon line begins to age through the 1960s, they start to decline in quality. They start to decline in people's measure of them. They stop being the powerhouses they were at the beginning of the decade as they start to take certain components out of their cars. So, for example, the Mark II lost its leather upholstery, which was a big step down, and they had to pull a lot of the quality out of the Jaguars because they needed to retain profits. And their profit margins by this point were really being scuppered by the point I mentioned before, and that's that antiquated machinery. That's Brown's Lane not having the efficiency of a modern, let's say, German car plant, because the Germans had to start from scratch. The British didn't after the end of the Second World War, and so they were still using very old-fashioned machinery, and they would be all the way through to the 1990s when Ford came to Jaguar and kind of were just shocked. Their heads blew off at looking at the working conditions, looking at the kind of machinery that Jaguar was still using in the 1990s. But the seeds for that were all sown before the Second World War, and they're starting to, they're starting to bud now in the mid-1960s as Jaguar have to pull this quality out of their saloon cars. Now, in 1963, they augmented the Mark II with the more sophisticated S-Type. They gave it a more Mark X style, very cigar-y kind of shape to the rear end of the S-Type, and they gave it the independent rear suspension. So the S-Type is a more sophisticated, better handling, better performing car than the Mark II, but it's maybe not quite as fast because it has a bit more weight to lug around. But they kept the Mark II running alongside it because the profit margins were higher and people were still buying them and people wanted that more affordable saloon car. So we get to the point where the Mark X has effectively failed, I'm afraid to say. They were fundamentally good cars, but the Mark X has failed. The Mark II, the S-Type, they were beginning to decline in their quality, and they were beginning to decline in people's minds as well. Their perception was growing worse over time. And so they replaced both of these saloon car lines with something that sits in between them, which of course is the first Jaguar XJ in 1968. And as with the E-Type back in 61, we can say they totally revolutionised their style. The only thing that remained from the previous saloon car lines of Jaguars was the general front-end silhouette from the Mark X. That's all that was really left. Everything from the nose back was brand new stylistically. It was much sharper, it had a much more defined shape, something that would suit the 1970s so much better, and of course, it did just that. And in 1968, the new Jaguar XJ6 was referred to as the greatest car in the world, because it had so much quality built into its engineering. Maybe not its build so much, but it had that brilliant independent rear suspension. It still had the XK straight six, and in the package it now found itself, it was virtually unmatched all over the world. But again, you could say that while mechanically it was very similar to the Mark X and of course the S-Type, stylistically it was a fresh start. Jaguar had not evolved their traditional lithesome, very curvy shape which had existed since the 1950s. Instead, they decided in 1968, we're going to start fresh. So it's understandable why some people would view the XJ as controversial, but they didn't, because everybody was used to Jaguar doing this, to Jaguar saying every now and then, we're going to start from scratch, we're going to produce something new, vibrant, exuberant, that is going to beat the world. They did it in 1948 with the XK120. They did it in 1961 with the E-Type, and here they were doing it again for the second time this decade in 1968 with the XJ6. Then in 1972, Jaguar pull away from any other saloon car builder in the world by bringing us the 12-cylinder engine. That Jaguar V12, it's hard to overstate its importance to the motor industry in 1972. Because there was no other saloon car in the world that was available with 12 cylinders. And so between 1971, 72 and the mid to late 1980s, I think it was 1987, that BMW launched their 750i with their own V12. If you wanted a 12-cylinder saloon car, the ultimate in smoothness, the ultimate in sonority, you had to buy a Jaguar. I cannot overstate the importance of that. In that period, the only saloon car you could buy that was 5.3-litre V12 engine was a Jaguar XJ. It was remarkable for so many reasons. And of course, they put that 12-cylinder engine in the E-Type as well. Maybe not quite as successfully as in the XJ Saloon, because it added extra weight to the E-Type. The E-Type had started to become a Grand Tourer by this stage. And that neatly brings us back to that sports car line, because the next car we need to address is the XJS that I talked about right at the beginning of this podcast. So the E-Type launched in 1961 as this fabulous, world-beating, beautiful, fastest car in the world, sports car, You could maybe even describe it as a supercar. The supercar didn't really exist then. By the beginning of the 70s, it did. We had the likes of the Lamborghini Miura, for example. But in the early 1960s, the supercar didn't exist. The E-Type was as close as you were going to get to supercar status. But by the early 1970s, its market focus had really shifted. No longer was it a out-and-out sports car. It wasn't a kind of D-type replacement. Not a racing car, but as close as you were going to get to a racing car for something designed for the road. It had moved away from that, and it had grown into a bit of a grand tourer. So in 1966, I believe, Jaguar launched the 2+2 body style of the E-Type, a car that I think was not the prettiest thing in the world. I think it really ruined the proportions of the E-Type, but it was an important car because it gave that extra versatility to the E-Type, that ability to carry 4 people, and the E-Type then started to age quite badly after that. The Series 2 and the Series 3 E-Types all gained weight. They gained width. They gained impact bumpers, for example. They lost the covered headlamps, which made the early cars, made the Series 1s look so sleek. Many people say the E-Type was ruined by all these modifications, but what was not, it was undoubted by anyone, is that it had moved from sports car to GT. Because that's what Jaguar buyers wanted. The E-Type, by the late 60s, early 70s, was not competing with the Lamborghini Miura. It was not a supercar anymore. The world had moved on, and Jaguar had seen its customer base look towards the E-Type and like the look of the E-Type, but they wanted the refinement they maybe got in an S-Type or a Mark X, for example. They wanted that refinement in their more sporting roadster or coupe. And so the 2+2 made a lot of sense, and the V12 engine made a lot of sense. The automatic gearboxes made a lot of sense when it came to the later E-Types, because they were marketing them mainly towards the American market, because that's where a lot of their profits lay, but towards that more grand touring, that more laid-back nature, rather than the out-and-out sports car nature. So then we get to move towards Jaguar's probably their most controversial car, up to the point of the Type 00, of course, which I think is undoubtedly more controversial than any Jaguar has ever been, and that's the XJS. So in 1961, 68, and now in 1975, Jaguar have completely revolutionised themselves. The XJS was not an E-Type replacement as we saw it in 1961. Instead, the XJS was a replacement for the E-Type as we saw it in the 70s, with that V12 engine, with that automatic gearbox in the 2+2 body style. That later, the first XJSs were designed to be grand tourers, first and foremost. They were replacing the very end of the line, the last of the line E-Types that were also grand tourers. But regardless, when it was launched in 1975, it was of course very controversial. It was controversial because it was not what people were expecting from Jaguar. After all, we've just had the fuel crisis in the early 1970s, the Yom Kippur War, the 3-day week in the UK, etc., which really knackered the car market in many ways and sent the price of fuel through the roof. And so for Jaguar to come out with an all-new, big, automatic gearbox Grand Tourer with that same 5.3-litre V12, which does all of 10-15 miles per gallon, was a bit of a shock. Even though we'd already seen it in the XJ12 Saloon and we'd seen it in the E-Type, it was still a bit of a shock for Jaguar to come out with this, rather than to come out with a true E-Type replacement. To replace the E-Type as it was in 1961 and bring out a new, smaller, maybe lighter, more compact 2-seater sports car. Instead, they went all in with the grand touring nature, bringing us the XJS, which of course had been in development since the mid-1960s. It was the last car that Sir William Lyons, Mr. Jaguar himself, had. It's not the last one he had involvement in, it was the last one that he had involvement as a day-to-day business. When he was still running the company, when it still belonged to him in the 1960s, they were just starting to develop the XJS. And even after Jaguar was sold to British Leyland in 1968, or more, they were sold to BMC in 1966, Sir William Lyons remained I think it was as managing director, but he certainly remained at Jaguar running it day to day, certainly. And you could even say, just as a little aside, that the XJ6, and later the XJ12, of course, the XJ line of saloon cars was only possible because Jaguar was sold to BMC. Jaguar did not have the money to actually productionize the car. They designed it virtually already, but they hadn't productionized it because they didn't have the money for the new tooling. And so being sold to BMC and then British Leyland, they suddenly had the ability to productionize the XJ. So had Jaguar not been sold to BMC and then British Leyland, they might not have existed today at all. They might not have ever been able to launch the XJ, and so that's a huge part of our perception of Jaguar, is how weren't British Leyland awful? Yes, they were, but Jaguar might not be around at all without them. So, there are two different sides to that party. But the XJS had been in development since before BL took over. And William Lyons was, of course, there for that. It was William Lyons' decision, along with Malcolm Sayer, who was their aerodynamicist, who was their chief designer, other than Sir William himself, at that time period. And Malcolm Sayer dictated the form of the XJS to Sir William Lyons in a letter from around 1967-68, there or thereabouts. So they had a few different projects on the go. They were experimenting. They were figuring out what they wanted to do with this E-Type replacement. They were figuring out where they wanted it to lead to. So they thought initially that they could do a mid-engine car. Of course, they saw the likes of the Lamborghini Miura being launched, and mid-engine cars before that as well. And in 1966, Jaguar had previewed, shall we say, the XJ13, which was their prototype Le Mans racer that didn't actually get raced. It was the first time we saw the Jaguar V12, a good 5-6 years before it went into mainstream production, in the middle of this very lithesome, very D-type looking racer. Again, destined for Le Mans, but never actually raced there. So that was still fresh in their minds. In 1967-68 was the XJ13. Should we do a mid-engine sports car? Should we do a racing car? So maybe that E-Type replacement was very much on the cards, but they decided against it for a couple of reasons. First of all, it would have cost a lot of money to productionize an all-new platform mid-engine rear-wheel drive. It would have cost the earth, and they didn't have the money to do that. But also, they saw the progression of the E-Type into that into that grand touring nature. And so they didn't necessarily want to upset anyone. They didn't want to rock the boat. They saw something good happening to their profit margins, at least, if not maybe to the design of the E-Type. But they wanted to continue that. And so they took the platform of the XJ Saloon, reclothed it in this new, I think, beautiful Malcolm Sayer designed body, and that became the XJS. But it was set out in this letter to Sir William Lyons all the way back in 1968 that it was going to be front-engine, rear-wheel drive, based on the platform of the XJ12. So a lot of people say that the XJS was meant to be mid-engined. It wasn't. That's not true, I'm afraid. I understand why some people think it was, especially with the XJ13, but that's just not the case, I'm afraid to say. Not quite, anyway. So the 1970s progress, and eventually we get to 1975 when the XJS is launched. In the mid-1970s, aerodynamic styling was not really a big deal yet. Sure, everyone had done it in the 1930s, and some manufacturers were starting to turn their heads towards it, but as a rule, it wasn't the done thing at this point. And so for the XJS to launch in 1975 with a very aerodynamic-led body, as I said, Malcolm Sayer was an aerodynamicist, and unfortunately he passed away in 1970 when they were still very much working on the XJS, but it bears his hallmarks. That's why the XJS has a very, very small frontal area. That's why it has those famous buttresses at the back. They're nothing to do with the car potentially being mid-engined. They are there purely for the efficiency of the air travelling over the car. But that style was very modern, was very, very, it was brand new. Nobody had seen the likes of it before, and so compared to the E-Type, which we were all so used to, 14 years of E-Type, one of the most successful Jaguar cars built, certainly the one that people even today still remember when we think of Jaguar, they suddenly replace it with something that looks nothing like it. It has this big V12 and it's not very successful in its first few years, partly because people's perception of Jaguar's quality, I say perception, truth, let's be honest, about Jaguar's quality was not great. People didn't necessarily want to trust Jaguar in that period, but also the XJS drank fuel. And in that mid-70s landscape, in the economy of the mid-1970s, an XJS was potentially not a smart buy. And if you had the money to really not worry about fuel, for example, you maybe didn't buy an XJS. And that's because throughout this period, Jaguar were known for how affordable they were. So an E-Type, for example, was famously half the price of an equivalent Ferrari, in spite of the fact that the E-Type was faster, and the E-Type was probably better looking as well. But that extended through to the XJS in 1975, so someone who was looking for a big, grand touring 2+2 had a choice of buying XJS, which is, a very expensive car, don't get me wrong, but it's a car that is a lot more affordable and therefore a lot more common than the likes of a Lamborghini Espada. Now, the Espada would have undoubtedly been left of field because Lamborghini was still finding their feet at this point. But the Espada was more expensive than the average house price in Great Britain in the 1970s. But it was competing with the XJS, whether you like it or not, because the XJS was not competing with more run-of-the-mill sports cars. You were not considering whether to buy an XJS or a Capri 3-litre. That was absolutely not your question. Your question was whether to buy an XJS or an Espada. And that's some serious company we have to put Jaguar in with. It's the thing I mentioned earlier on, that a lot of people view Jaguar today as a much more mainstream than they were in period. Certainly they were mainstream enough just by the cost of their cars. They were very, very affordable. But in terms of their performance, they punched way above their weight with what they were doing. And the way they managed to do this was to pull out quality. Now, again, this feeds into why maybe Jaguar started to become slightly less successful, because people did not view the XJS as being as high a quality as maybe some other big GT 2+2s that were available at the time. So someone who had the money to spend on a Lamborghini or Ferrari probably went for a Lamborghini or Ferrari. They didn't bother with a Jaguar because it wouldn't have been as high a quality, and of course it was more common. They wanted that exclusivity. But just to give you a bit of an idea, rather than just preaching, I'm going to give you a bit of proof. So of all the motoring journalists, few have as much of an aura around them as Mr. Setright, famous for writing in Car magazine for decades and decades. And he, across a few different spells, said that he didn't like Jaguar. Did not like any Jaguar, because they built a car, and they built a car that punched way above its weight. They built these engineering thoroughbreds that did brilliant things on roads, some of them the fastest cars in the world, etc. But the way they kept them affordable was to take out any ounce of quality. And so he would get into a Jaguar and just poke around it, as road testers do, as road testers have to, and look under the seats and stuff and see where they cut all their corners. Jaguar did not build quality cars, it's safe to say. And so we understand why in the 1970s the XJS may not have been that successful. It was too mainstream, not high quality enough for the really highbrow buyers. And it was still maybe out of reach of the more mainstream buyers, certainly in terms of its fuel economy in that time period. But regardless, the XJS was incredibly fast. Sure, it may not have been a convertible initially. The styling may have shocked everyone, and it wasn't an original E-Type replacement. It wasn't a sports car, it was a GT. The XJS was incredibly and appallingly controversial, but a lot of people therefore remember it as something it wasn't. I've had a lot of people on my videos on my own channel, on TwinCam, shameless plug, about the XJS. I've had people on Manor Park's YouTube channel, on our YouTube channel here, say that the XJS was nothing special, to say that it just drank fuel, didn't really move, they didn't have much get up and go about them, they were slow. And I've had the same thing on other social medias as well. I've had it on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc. whenever the XJS is mentioned, and I just do not understand where that comes from. As far as I can tell, that is probably a little bit of... I don't quite know how to say this. I think it's people's naturally negative perceptions of not necessarily British cars, but certain cars that were aligned with certain companies. British Leyland. But in 1975, a Jaguar XJS would do 154 miles per hour and would do 60 miles per hour in 6.9 seconds. 6.9 seconds to 60, that's really the big one, but also over 150 miles per hour. And I'm getting all this information, by the way, from, if you are actually watching this, I have this world car record, which is a record of every single specification written in Autocar magazine between the beginning, at the end of the 19th century and 1990. There's also a new version of this that is currently being compiled, which will bring it up to date, and that is very much on my Christmas list. But for someone like me, who is a professional talk-to-yourselfer, this kind of resource is absolutely critical to getting true statistics, to getting true facts, to stop being misled by some things that can be said on the internet. But that's where I get this information from. So, XJS will do 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds. Compare that, for our American viewers, let's say, to a Chevrolet Corvette in this same time period in the mid-70s. A Corvette would only do 60 miles per hour in 8.1 seconds. We don't have a top speed figure for the Corvette, I'm afraid. It's not in this world car record, but 8.1 seconds compared to 6.9 for the Jag. We then have something like the BMW 633 CSI, the newly launched E24 BMW, the first 6 Series, the top spec 633 CSI, would only do 132 miles per hour, and it would take over 8 seconds, again 8.1 seconds, to get to 60 miles per hour. BMW's flagship big coupe was significantly slower than a Jaguar XJS. We then have something like the Lamborghini Espada, probably the XJS's biggest competitor in terms of its mad styling, in terms of its V12 engine, in terms of its general body style, and an Espada will do 150 miles per hour. That's all well and good. Not quite at XJS levels, but it will do 150. But to 60, it will take 7.8 seconds. 7.8 seconds to get to 60 miles per hour, which is just, by modern standards, that's snail's pace. An XJS would do it in 6.9. Hugely fast in comparison. We then move on again and say, proper supercar, mid-engine rear-wheel drive, De Tomaso Pantera, huge V8 engine. That will only do 143 miles per hour. And it will do 7.6 seconds to 60. It's 7/10 of a second slower than an XJS. And while the Pantera may not be the most mainstream of supercars, in this time period in the mid-1970s, the XJS would just blow the pants off anything else. We can move even more and say, look at a Porsche 911S, for example. Look at a Porsche 911S will only do 138 miles per hour, and it will take 7.5 seconds to get to 60. A little bit faster than the Pantera, but still nothing really special. Then we can move to something incredibly serious. V12 supercar, mid-engine, rear-wheel drive, Ferrari 512BB. Berlinetta Boxer, which of course is not a Boxer engine. It's just a 180-degree V12. It's a flat 12, it's not a Boxer engine. They called it a Boxer, but hey, I digress. A 512BB will do 175 miles per hour, which totally does blow the socks off the XJS. But to get to 60 miles per hour, it will take 7.2 seconds. 7.2 seconds to 60, when an XJS will do it in 6.9. Are we getting the idea now that the XJS is something seriously special that so many of us do not remember it for, purely because we are biased against it because of how controversial it was in period? We can move on a little bit further than that even, and we can say a Lamborghini Countach. This is an original Countach, not a Countach S. This is as the Countach was launched just a year before the XJS, and as it remained until 1976. So you could buy one of the two. You could buy an XJS, or you could buy a Countach. Sure, quite different cars, but still, you could buy them at the same time. A Countach will do 192 miles per hour. Fair enough. But in Britain, you can't do 192. You can, however, do 0 to 60 in 6.8 seconds. That is quicker than an XJS, but it's only quicker by 1/10 of a second. Realistically, you could take an automatic Jaguar XJS and a manual Lamborghini Countach. Of course it's a manual Lamborghini Countach. Put them together in a drag race, and they will be virtually neck and neck. That's how powerful, how sublime the XJS was in this period. Now, we will give a little bit of negative context and say there was one car that I've come across that will just rocket out into the distance, and that's the Porsche 930, the original 911 Turbo. That will do 156 miles per hour. It will slightly edge out the XJS in a straight line. It won't get near the Countach in a straight line. But on a sprint, in a drag race, that will do 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds. So again, it's a little bit quicker than a Countach, and now 2/10 quicker than than an XJS. But still, the XJS is one heck of a car in 1975, and it was important to spend that time talking about it, to just put it in that context, because it is so much faster, so much more capable than anyone would expect it to be. And thanks to that same Jaguar independent rear suspension, that silky smooth V12 as well, the XJS was virtually unparalleled. Yes, it had very, very lightweight steering. Again, it was a Grand Tourer designed to float effortlessly across continents, but that independent rear suspension meant that it handled better, and the double wishbone front end meant it handled better than the vast, vast majority of cars. Bear in mind, Ferrari at this point was still using live axles in their big GTs, the 365 GT4 2+2, the wedge shape, probably my favourite Ferrari. Which became the Ferrari 400 later on. But in its original 365 status, which did compete with the XJS, was a bit slower than the XJS. They were still using live axles. They were not sophisticated cars by any stretch of the imagination. And then you got Jaguar coming out here, undercutting all of them by a huge margin on price, but being able to go toe-to-toe with them in a straight line and exceed them in the corners. It is totally unsurprising that in later years, even though it was not designed to do so, the XJS was converted into a racing car. And it's funny in that context that as soon as they made it a racing car, the XJS started to sell quite well. And I was reading through Instagram a few weeks ago, and I stumbled across a post by Ian Callum. Or a comment from Ian Callum, actually. Ian Callum, of course, who was Jaguar's lead designer for years. Very, very well-respected chap. Ian Callum says something, you listen to it. And he said that the reason the XJS became successful was purely because it went racing. It won everything, and then people started to love it because it gained pedigree. It gained pedigree that the E-Type had, but the XJS didn't in 1975. So it's funny how these things come around. And over the XJS's 21-year life, making it potentially, depending on how you define it, Jaguar's longest running model and also their most successful model, the XJS did become a big success, but it wasn't in the early years. They thought about canning it in the late 70s, going into the early 1980s, but they didn't. They let it live, and it became an icon. And as we sit here now in 2024, as of recording anyway, it'll probably be 2025 by the time you see this or hear this. But it's coming up to the XJS's 50th birthday. And as I laboured the point on the XK120, should I say, before, I've had to labour the point on the XJS because so many people either don't view it in the context it was designed to be in the context it was in its early years, and don't appreciate it for how important it was for Jaguar and how it grew into such a successful car. But yeah, the XJS is something to behold, something we all ought to love a lot more than we do. I love the styling, understand some people don't, and that's fine. Each to our own. If we all had the same taste in cars, life would be very, very boring, wouldn't it? But yeah, the XJS is something to behold. But alongside it, we have that XJ Saloon line of cars. Now, the Series 1 XJ, the XJ6 and XJ12, became the Series 2 in 1974, which became the Series 3 in 1981, and lived all the way through, therefore, to 1986 in 6-cylinder form, and 1992 in 12-cylinder form. So, again, depending on how we define it, we could say that actually the series line of XJs are Jaguar's most successful model, followed by the XJS, and also the longest running model as well. But it all depends on how we define it. Do we count those 3 series XJs as the same car? I would suggest we do, because the XJS underwent a few serious modifications, facelifts during its life as well. So I would not say the XJS is Jaguar's longest running model. I would say the XJ series saloons are. But when it comes time to replace those line of Series XJs, everybody knew what to expect from a Jaguar saloon. While Jaguar had revolutionised themselves in the saloon car line in 1968 by launching the original XJ, by the mid-1980s, things were very different. People were very, very used to the general silhouette of the XJ, and maybe they weren't that willing to let it go this time. Similarly, Jaguar had that whole period of time under British Leyland, and they'd been developing the new XJ, known as the XJ40, for that entire time. But they just hadn't been able to launch it, and so it was only when Jaguar had become independent after 1984, then in 86, that they were able to launch the new XJ40. Only then, and only then in 1992 were they able to put the V12 in it, reportedly because they designed that new XJ40 in order to not be able to put the Rover V8 in it to kind of maintain Jaguar's lineage, to maintain Jaguar's independence, to stop them becoming a derivative of British Leyland, stop them becoming dependent on BL. Whether all that's true or not is a matter for a different day, but the XJ40 was launched in 1986, and it just looked like an XJ. Yes, it was fresher, yes, it was new, it got rid of the peaks at the back, it was a much flatter car, much more conservatively styled car. Certainly it had those very period-correct, big, rectangular headlamps on the front of it, but it still looked like an XJ. And so Jaguar had gone from being revolutionary in 1948, 1961, 1968, and 1975 to by 1986 being very stuck in their ways. Now, I would suggest that's down to a number of reasons, more than we will go into today, but there are 2 major ones I want to discuss. First is the fact that they were owned by British Leyland. There wasn't the money to go around, there was a lot of inertia within British Leyland as a whole, which naturally spread down to Jaguar and stopped them from being able to just blow everyone else out of the water with this new second new generation XJ, should we say. But also I would suggest that it's something to do with the XJS, because everyone was so shocked by the XJS in 1975. Everyone was so reticent towards the styling direction that the XJS brought with it that maybe it scared Jaguar off. Maybe it made Jaguar more conservative, made them a little bit scared of themselves, made it a little bit scared of their own ambition, and forced their hand into producing a more derivative second-generation XJ. Then, as an independent, Jaguar didn't really have the money to replace it, and so the XJ40 was replaced by itself, really. It was reclothed into the X300 in 1994, and then into the X308 in 1997, that time with the all-new AJ V8, which still lives on today. It's the same 5-litre V8 we still see in the likes of the new Defender. But that engine was brand new in 1996, 97, there or thereabouts. And this was by which point Jaguar were owned by Ford. And this presents a bit of a new future for Jaguar, where they're finally getting some investment. So I mentioned earlier that when Ford walked into Jaguar in 1989, 1990, there or thereabouts, they were quite shocked by what they saw. They saw a disgrace, really. And Ford's big plan was to not revolutionise Jaguar, not to pull them out of their comfort zone, not to replace the XJ40, but instead for Jaguar to start building the XJ40 to a decent standard. Jaguar themselves actually already had on the drawing board an all-new XJ that would be launched at some point in 1994, 95, there or thereabouts, maybe a little bit before even. But Ford cancelled that project and said, instead, why don't you look at the XJ40 and see how you can improve it, how you can build it to a better quality, how you can build it to a better standard, how we can make more money out of it, how we can increase profit margins by streamlining production. And that's where we got the X300 from, and then the X308. But again, those two cars may have been a little bit more lithesome, may have had the curviness of the original XJ, maybe a little bit of the S-Type and the Mark II, and of course the Mark X as well. A bit of that roundedness in their side profiles had come back, but it still looked just like an XJ. And then in 2003, they finally launched the all-new aluminium-bodied X350 XJ. And while that car was all new under the skin, it was again quite revolutionary because it had that all-aluminium construction, that very well-performing AJ V8 that was launched a few years prior. The X350 still looked like an XJ. I think it looked a lot better than the X308 because it looked a lot sturdier. It had a much grander stance to it than the old 308, which I think looked a little bit kind of pinched towards the rear end. I think the X350 had that beefiness that I think a Jaguar needs. But again, it looked just like a Jag. And through all this time, up until 1998 anyway, there had been no smaller Jaguar. The XJ was what we know today as Mercedes S-Class, BMW 7 Series size, maybe a little bit smaller than those cars at various spells, but generally it was on that plane. There was nothing smaller. And so by the end of the 1990s, Jaguar were met by a car market that was so very, very different to how it was 30 years before in 1968. So in 1968, it was okay for Jaguar to launch one new saloon car to replace their two existing cars. But by 1998, they'd lost a huge amount of ground to your BMW, Mercedes-Benz, even Audi. Two of those three manufacturers of which barely registered on Jaguar's radar all the way back in 1968. So I want to bring in BMW to this discussion, and this brings us towards the modern Jaguar. It brings us to why Jaguar have now failed and need to do something totally new with the Type 00. So back in 1962, BMW had no pedigree. They had no philosophy. They had no clear design identity, but that was all first founded in 1962 with the Neue Klasse. Then they cut down the Neue Klasse's platform into a two-door saloon car known as the O2 series in 1966, and then extended that platform into the, I think, beautifully styled six-cylinder New 6 in 1968. Those three cars are the lines we now know as the 5 Series, 3 Series, and 7 Series. And through the 1970s and into the 1980s, BMW steadily built their pedigree. They went racing. They won touring car championship after touring car championship after touring car championship with either the Neue Klasse O2 series or, of course, the New 6, most famously as the 3-litre CSL in coupe form. But those three cars and their successors all had a very clear philosophy. They were gently evolutionary. They changed over time to the point where a BMW from the 90s didn't look very much like a BMW from the 1960s, apart from a few styling identities. The quad headlamps, the kidney grills, the Hofmeister kink. That's about it, really, that was all left from that original BMW style in the 1960s. So they evolved gradually. They weren't beholden to their style, but they wanted a BMW to always look at least somewhat like a BMW. That's a line from BMW's famous stylist in the late 70s and the 1980s, Klaus Luther, that a BMW should always look like a BMW. And so that's a philosophy that the Germans held. But through these decades, BMW were able to build up a market. They were able to build up a sense of brand loyalty, of brand identity, so that if someone would maybe downsize their Ford Granada, or maybe even a Ford Sierra, and downsize into a BMW 3 Series, for example, they would do that, and then they would look towards the 5 Series. And then when they had a 5 Series, they would look towards the 7 Series. And they'd be contained within that BMW, that BMW sphere, that BMW brand loyalty. for the rest of their lives, hopefully. It's a big deal in the corporate car land, the company car land, should I say, of the United Kingdom, in that companies like BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and later Audi were able to do this. They were able to build up brand loyalty through a shared sense of style and identity through their range of cars, which then would lead to people sticking with them for the rest of their lives. I don't know how many cars BMW makes today, but I reckon it's approaching 20. BMW have filled virtually every niche and have now started to water down their brand. They do front-wheel drive cars. They do lots and lots of four-cylinder cars, lots and lots of diesels. The straight sixes are dying out. They don't do V12s anymore, as Jaguar abandoned in the late 90s. But we'll see where BMW go in the next 20, 30, 40 years. But the position BMW are now is that they have chased volume. They have chased mainstream. BMW sell a huge number of cars in the UK, as do Mercedes-Benz, as do Audi. But I think BMW are the best example of this because they started in the 1960s in Jaguar's glory years. So, at this point, by the mid to late 1990s, Jaguar have lost out on this whole company car market. They have lost totally on any aspect of the brand loyalty that BMW have built up. Because to get into a Jaguar, you've got to go straight in at the top. You've got to go in and get a nice Jag XJ with a big six-cylinder engine, maybe a V12, or by the early 2000s, a V8. And so there was nowhere really to latch onto. So Jaguar, under Ford's ownership, realised that they had to start moving down a little bit into that mainstream market if they wanted to chase sales volumes, if they wanted to chase what BMW and Mercedes-Benz have been chasing for the last 10 years or so, ultimate sales volumes. They needed a new, smaller Jag. And so they launched the S-Type. Of course, it's still rear-wheel drive. You can have it with a nice V8 or, of course, the smaller V6 if you like. It was a perfectly adequate challenger to the BMW 5 Series or the Mercedes E-Class. But the S-Type had two serious faults. First of all, it had a dreadful Ford-based interior, which did not do it any favours and was eventually facelifted out of it. Fair enough. They realised their mistake and changed it. But the exterior styling of the S-Type wasn't new. And it didn't look anything like, the XJ that was its bigger brother. Instead, it looked like the old S-Type from the 1960s, which meant it looked all gawky and weird at the front. The S-Type is an ugly car, and I think virtually everybody agrees with me on that there. And the S-Type sold in decent enough numbers, but it never really took the challenge to the likes of the 5 Series, the E-Class, the Audi A6 even. Jaguar couldn't do it, because by this point they were stuck in that rut. Of course, they then launched the X-Type at the beginning of the 2000s, chasing the 3 Series, the C-Class, the Audi A4 example. They started chasing these sales volumes. They had a coherent range of 3 executive cars: XJ, S-Type, and X-Type. But again, the X-Type just looked like a shrunken-down XJ. Itself, a car that looked like a tribute to a car launched in 1968. And so Jaguar became a bit fuddy-duddy. Jaguar's image was stuck with the launch of the XJ in 1968, partly thanks to how controversial the XJS was at its launch. And so we realised that Jaguar had gone from being quite revolutionary in their glory days, for being new, not being afraid to challenge norms, to challenge people's perspectives, to launch something new and fresh and different, to then just launching the same thing over and over again. And then they tried to ape the premium German marques in producing a range of cars, none of which really had, all that much panache to it when compared to a 3 Series or a 5 Series BMW. Coming back to the sports car line for a moment, we see the XK, which was launched in 1996, and then the third gen XK, should we call it, after the original ones. The X100 XK launched in 1996, and the Ian Callum designed XK launched in 2005, I believe. And those two cars looked contemporary enough, but they harked back to the E-Type. They didn't hark back to the XJS, they didn't attempt to ape the XJS, nor did they attempt to ape the original line of XKs. Or, of course, did they furrow their own path? Did they create their own future? Instead, they looked straight back to the E-Type. And so in 2006, shall we say, at the very end of Jaguar's lull, we see the X-Type, which looks like a shrunken XJ. The S-Type, which looks like a throwback to a car from the 1960s. The XJ, which looks like a throwback to a car from the 1960s. And the XK, which is very cool, is very modern in its own way, but still has so much of the E-Type going on in it. Jaguar realise that they have to modernise. If they're going to get anywhere in this world, if they're going to take the fight to these modern German premium marques, they're going to have to start from scratch. And they do so with the new XF, that Ian Callum designed XF, the original one, in 2007. Under the skin, it was still based on the S-Type, which again was a very good car, and there was no problem with that whatsoever. But stylistically, it was totally modern. It was brand new. It washed away the last 40 years worth of Jaguar styling staleness. It had all started afresh, but it still looked like a Jaguar. It still had so much of that character going on. It had quite a lithesome nature. It had those brilliant headlamps, that very Jaguar grille on the front end of it. If you showed anyone that car, they'd still be able to tell you that it looked like a Jaguar, but it looked totally contemporary, totally fresh. And when they facelifted it in 2012, it gained those swoopy, hooded headlamps. It gave it a bit of the attitude of the Rover 75, which I bet is not a car you thought I was going to refer to here. But I love the Rover 75, so I am not going to excuse any opportunity to not stick it in. It gained those hooded headlamps, and it was a wonderful looking car. But then they followed it up with the new XF and the XE, the smaller XE, and they both just look like the 2007 Ian Callum XF again. They didn't look like anything fresh. It's as if Jaguar had not learnt their lesson. Yes, the sales volumes of the XF were good, but they were not quite what they wanted. And so you'd think they would keep trying to progress, keep trying to modernise, not get stuck in that rut that they did again, but they've done just that. So the likes of BMW, for example, in the early 2000s, had totally changed their image. They'd gone through that controversial spell of Chris Bangle designs and had looked very, very contemporary. And while a BMW still looked like a BMW, it did so in a very fresh way. The second-gen XF and the XE just looked like the original XF again. To the untrained eye, you wouldn't be able to tell there was a generational difference between the two, and so it's no surprise to anyone that those two cars failed to live up to expectations. Sure, in 2009, Jaguar launched the new XJ, the X351, which again totally set a new bar for Jaguar design. It had that same kind of front end as the X250 XF, complete with the hooded headlamps, but the back of it had bits of XJ in there. It had the triangular silhouette to the rear lamps, but they were very slender, they were very slim. It had that beautiful kind of yacht-style rear end to it. The new XJ, as it was in 2009, was a heck of a car, and it sold in fantastic numbers. In fact, it outsold the BMW 7 Series and the Mercedes S-Class. Proof that Jaguar could do it, that Jaguar's reputation was there to be built on, the heritage was there, but people were just crying out for something that was novel, something that looked modern, like Jaguar were doing back in their glory days. They should not have been afraid to start from fresh and say, yes, this new car will still look like a Jaguar, but it will do so in a totally contemporary way. They should have listened to the advice that Klaus Luther gave to everyone at BMW back in the 1980s, and they should have made a Jaguar look like a Jaguar, but keep it evolving, keep it moving, do not get set in your ways. But of course, there was no XJ replacement. In 2019, after 10 years of production, the XJ quietly died. The electric XJ, which was due to replace it, was canned because reportedly it just wasn't quite good enough, which is understandable. Hold high standards for yourself. But if they weren't going to replace it with anything, then Jaguar were going to lose out on their historic market. They were just going to abandon it. They had the new line of SUVs, which were selling in decent numbers, in reasonable numbers, because the world had naturally shifted to them. But the XF and XE were by now withering on the vine. There was nothing new to replace them, and so Jaguar again ended up in a second lull. where there was nothing new, nothing forthcoming from Jaguar to give as a statement of intent. Sure, there was the I-Pace in 2018, which won European Car of the Year, and that image of Ian Callum very proudly holding the Car of the Year award is something we need to talk about in a few minutes, because I think, the I-Pace has been around for 6 years, 6, maybe 7 years. 2017, 2018, they launched it. People already forget it exists. It was brilliantly reviewed, and everyone went on about it at the time. Of course, it won European Car of the Year. But people seem to have forgotten about it, which is a very, very curious turn of events, but it's evidence of Jaguar's fall from grace. It's evidence of Jaguar's fall off from that high period of the late 2000s when we saw the new XF, the new XJ, and thought, wow, this is potentially it. This is what we could be doing. This is the new future of Jaguar. Suddenly, it was all gone again. So that brings us to the Type 00, and I've seen a number of articles in a number of different outlets describing this as Jaguar's first electric vehicle, which of course it's not. The I-Pace exists, and the I-Pace was relatively successful. Maybe it didn't kick on as they wanted to. They didn't replace it in due course. But hey, it exists, and people forget that it exists. But I totally understand why Jaguar feel the need now to totally change everything they've done. Because up to this point, they're just not getting results. They've tried on 3 occasions now, 3 different generations of cars, the S-Type, the XF, and the second XF, to emulate BMW, to emulate Audi, to emulate Mercedes-Benz, and chase the mainstream, chase sales volumes, and it hasn't worked. Partly because people's perception of Jaguar isn't strong enough. People have an issue with perceived quality, which is understandable. Decades gone by, it was a serious worry, and with BMW having built up a reputation for good quality, it takes some time for BMWs to wear off and Jaguars to come back on. So they're always going to be dealing with that. That's not something they can control. But what is slightly worse is the market conditions, is the economic argument. And this is not something that I've seen many people refer to when discovering why Jaguar haven't been able to meet the sales volumes of BMW, Audi, Mercedes-Benz, because they don't have the borrowing power. And because Jaguar don't have the borrowing power, they don't have the ability to offer these incredibly competitive lease deals that BMW, Audi, Mercedes-Benz do. And if they can't meet those very affordable lease deals, then no one's going to buy them. It's a simple fact of life that, if you're looking for a new executive car, if you're looking for a 5 Series size car, you see a 5 Series and an E-Class at a similar price, and then see a Jaguar that's more expensive, you're just going to discount it immediately. You're never going to look at it twice. You're going to say, oh, I'll stick with the 5 Series, that's fine, thanks very much. And so it's totally understandable why Jaguar haven't been able to meet the expectations of the mainstream market. This is why now they're deciding to leave the mainstream market and instead go for the hyper-luxury thing. Now, this isn't new for Jaguar. We come back to their glory days. We come back to that discussion we had about the XJS, about how it undercut the competition, but it punched way above its weight. Now Jaguar are going all in on that. They're going to punch with their weight now, and they're going to charge a premium for it. It's reported that this new Type 00, when eventually it is productionized, of course, we've seen a disguised test car out on the roads. It's going to cost over £200,000, which is a lot of money, and it's not a competitor for a Porsche 911. It's not a competitor for a Range Rover even. I know they're very different kinds of cars, but, big luxury car, not on the same plane. Hyper luxury is what Jaguar are now going for, and it's totally understandable why they feel the need to do that. First of all, because profit margins can be higher with these, ultra luxury cars. With these manufacturers, they make a lot more per car than more mainstream manufacturers do. But also, Jaguar couldn't compete in the mainstream premium saloon car market. So why try and flog a dead horse? Why try and keep going? It makes total sense for me to try something new. And if they're going to try something new, they have to rock the boat a little bit. They have to start afresh, and as Jerry McGovern, JLR's chief designer, said, copy nothing. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the Type 00, and tell me what you all think about it in the comments below, because it's going to be really interesting to see what people think about it now that the dust has settled a little bit, now that we've all calmed down a little bit and we've stopped being so uppity about that promo, which was a bit weird and didn't show any cars. But hey, look at the car, look at the actual car, rather than some people in funny colours. You know, what are we thinking about this? Because it does not look like an old XK. It doesn't look like an F-Type. It doesn't look like an E-Type. It doesn't look like an XK. People are going to naturally try and find similarities in the silhouette. And I understand that. But it's clear from the surfacing of that car, it's clear from the proportions, and it's clear from how brutal it is, that Jaguar are not borrowing anything from their own history. They're starting afresh, just as they did in 1975, in 1961, in 1948, in 1968, and maybe even in 2007 as well. Jaguar are starting afresh. I totally understand why that is, and I really hope Jaguar do well over the coming years, because it would be a travesty to see Jaguar go. A great British marque like that, still manufacturing their cars in the UK, still having all their design and engineering facilities in the UK. They might not be British owned, but I've seen some political commentators say that they hope Jaguar go bust, and I can't think of anything worse to say. I can't think of anything more... I can't think of anything less patriotic to say than that. Surely we all hope that Jaguar does well with this new car, which is very controversial, but it shouldn't be. It's only controversial because we're so used to Jaguar in these two laws, the post-2007 law and the post-1975 law. Jaguar in their glory days always pushed boundaries, always decided to copy nothing else. They were their own company and they forged their own path. So let's hope that Jaguar can do that in this new electric-led age. Although I do believe that they will put a range extender petrol engine in it. That's just my guess, that's my assumption, judging by the sheer length of the front end. There's surely enough space to put a little range extender. I don't think they'll do internal combustion only. I think that would be silly. But as a range extender, as we see in a number of new electric cars, the new Scouts, for example, that are being sold in the US, they're very, very cool things. If you've not seen them, Google them. They're so cool. But that means that people are more interested in old Jaguars now than they probably ever have been before. People are talking about Jaguar on a whole nother plane like they haven't done for many, many years. I find that really, really interesting. And it throws up a few questions for the classic car market as to how people are going to react. Are people going to take more interest in the old Jaguars? We don't know yet. We'll see how this progresses over the coming years. But at our last auction here at Manor Park Classics in December, we had a few Jaguars coming through. In fact, we had 3 Mark II shape Jaguars. We had one Mark II. It was only a little baby 2.4 litre one, but that was a project car. Only had 2 owners, lovely blue thing, and that sold for only £3,500. Jaguars were bargains back in period when they were brand new. Absolute bargains for what they were. And in many cases, they're still bargains today. We had 2 Daimler V8 250s. So barring the standard XK straight 6 that you've got in a Jag Mark II or an S-Type, in a Daimler, you instead got Daimler's own V8. Little small capacity 2.5 litre thing, which a lot of people say was a sweeter engine than the XK straight 6. We had 2 Daimler V8s, one that was a stalled restoration project that sold for only £2,100, and a great project it was too. But then we had a road-going example, a really charming example in a lovely, I was going to say a sage green. I think it's a slightly lighter shade than sage, but a lovely, very unique shade of green. 1968 Daimler V8 250, and that sold for £9,430. So that made some decent money there, but they're still bargains considering what they were in period and what they are today, the sheer heritage that Jaguar have. Maybe the one car that is not so much of a bargain from Jaguar is the E-Type. Because of our perception of the E-Type, how famous they are, how well known they are, their values are kind of in the stratosphere. So this is an E-Type 4.2 litre XK engine, 1970 model year, 2+2 coupe. As a restoration project, sold for £19,200. So that, again, made some good money. But then we move on to the XJSs. Because I mentioned before that the XJS is a thoroughly usable car. That car was designed in the late 60s, early 70s to waft across continents, and you can still very much do that today, and you can do it in such a classic style, a style that is only appreciating in people's minds with the smoothness of that 5.3-litre V12. We had a 1986 HE high efficiency. I know, what a name to give a V12. High efficiency XJS 5.3 coupe, and that sold for £9,200. That's good for an XJS. A few years ago, they were only doing something like 6,000. But regardless, you get a lot of car for your money there. We also had a Cabriolet XJS, a 3.6-litre one. That will only be a straight 6 rather than a V12 XJS, and that sold for £6,300. There are just bargains to be had everywhere. And this is a 1990 Jaguar XJRS 6-litre. This is the TWR car, of which I believe there are only 115 right-hand drive examples built. Just an incredibly rare piece of motoring history, and one with so much pedigree, because it is that TWR car. It is the racing car. It's not a racing car, really, is it? It's the 6-litre. It's got all that, the luxury upgrades to it. It's got £2,500 worth of, maybe more than that, actually, maybe £2,750 worth of hi-fi upgrade to this one. Again, it's a long-distance GT. But yes, the TWR Jaguar Sport Coupe 6-litre V12 sold for £12,600. And for £12,600 there, a lucky bidder has received an incredibly rare piece of motoring history. Something that if you know what it is, if you take this to a car show, everyone will surround it. But you've got something that's still so usable that you can use on an everyday basis. And this is something that I really love about old cars, and it's something that I hold very dear, is the ability to use them. A car as an ornament isn't really a car anymore. It's a piece of furniture. It's a sculpture. And while the XJS could very much be a sculpture, it is such a gorgeous shape. I love the cars that can actually be used and driven. And this car here with 106,000 miles on it is very, very usable. What a piece of motoring history there. But if you have managed to stay for this entire time and you enjoyed that little deep dive into Jaguar's history, because I wanted to contextualise and say why the Type 00, sure, it's controversial. I understand why everybody's saying so, but if we think about Jaguar's history, it really shouldn't be. Because Jaguar have done this before. Jaguar have broken boundaries before, have listened to nothing of their own heritage and started afresh. And goodness knows, I hope Jaguar finds some success. So thank you very much for tuning in today. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I hope you've stayed around for... We've been here for nearly an hour and a half now talking about Jaguar, but this is a little bit longer than maybe we'd have hoped it have been. But with Jaguar being topical, we wanted to give a bit of a deep dive into it. So if you're interested in seeing what's coming in for our next auction in February, then please do head over to our website. I'm sure we will have in due course some very, very tasty Jaguars, but do have a very lovely day.